Last October, I was watching Kat of Kat's Costumery make 2 new Hobbity bodices, and I decided I wanted to make one for myself. I went out and bought this beautiful, thick black fabric printed with flowers, along with some black twill tape to bind the edges. But then I got distracted. You know how it goes. A friend of mine gave me some beautiful white fabric printed with toile patterns in dark blue, and I decided I wanted to make a bodice out of that too. Then I realized I needed some kind of shift to go with the blue and white bodice, so I went back to the fabric store and found a lightweight blue linen, and I spent a month hand making an Elizabethan shift based largely on a video Morgan Donner made last year. Then I made the toile bodice, and then I took a month off from sewing because, after all of that, I was really tired. But you can see a video of me finishing the bodice on this channel, and you can see a video of the shift and bodice together on my Instagram. I'll include those links below. So it wasn't until February that I got around to making this black floral bodice, which is what this video is about. The pattern is based on one from Rabbit and Hat Patterns on Etsy, and I'll say up front that it is not historically accurate. These bodices were commonly worn in the 16th century, but the pattern has princess seams, which didn't come around until the 1800s. Also, I had to make some adjustments for the bodice to fit me. My belly is bigger than the pattern accounted for, so I added an extra panel to the pattern so it would fit right. And the shoulder straps were too wide for me, so I trimmed them down quite a bit. After getting all the pattern pieces the way I wanted them, I pinned them to the fabric and cut out all the pieces. I had already cut out the lining layer, which was made from an old white sheet. I decided to put the center panels on the fold and then cut them along the fold. This way the pattern of flowers will look more seamless across the front of the bodice when it's finished. The next step was to sew all of the lining pieces together, and then all of the fashion fabric pieces together. I used black thread on the white lining because I was feeling a little lazy and it was going to be on the inside anyway. After that, it was time to iron all the seams. If you're doing this yourself, make sure to iron the princess seams over a tailor's ham or another curved surface, otherwise the seams won't come out right. After assembling the lining and the outer layer of the bodice, I pinned them together along the seams and then stitched in the ditch to hold them together. Stitch along the princess seams in the front, the side seams, and the shoulder seams. The stitching along the side seams becomes the basis for 2 boning channels, as you'll see in a little bit. Be really careful to match up the lining and outer seams exactly. Otherwise, you'll wind up with layers that don't line up nicely and panels that might be too loose or too tight against the other layer of fabric. This next bit involves hand stitching, a lot of hand stitching. First, I pinned the twill tape to the outside of the bodice, along the front edges, and across the top of the whole bodice. And then I used a running stitch to fasten it into place. I didn't get any footage of this for some reason, I'm sorry. After I fastened the twill tape to the outside, I folded it over to the inside, pinned it in place, and then stitched it to the lining with small whip stitches. Doing it this way makes the stitching on the trim invisible from the outside of the bodice, but it does take a long time. I find hand sewing meditative, but you might not have the patience for it, or you might not like it for some other reason, and that's okay too. You can always do it by machine, but then the stitches will be visible. For now, I'm leaving off the trim on the bottom of the bodice, so I can sew the boning channels and then slide the bones into place. Now I'm starting to sew the boning channels. I slid the first bone, made from a heavy-duty black zip tie, in between the layers of the bodice so that it's flush against the center seam. Then, with the zip tie in place, I sewed along the other side of it, being careful not to sew through the zip tie. I've only done that once, but my sewing machine really didn't like it. After I sewed in the first boning channel, I marked a line a ½ inch away, which became the start of the second boning channel. That ½ inch space is where the grommets will go for lacing up the bodice. In total, I added 2 bones on either side of the opening and 1 on each of the side seams. There are a lot of different ways to trim and smooth out the ends of the bones, or the zip ties, so that they don't poke holes in the fabric. I just use scissors. Once all of the boning channels and bones were in, I sewed the rest of the twill tape onto the bottom edge of the bodice. I did this the same way as before. Sewed the binding to the outside of the bodice first, then folded it to the inside and stitched it to the lining. I didn't record this process, unfortunately. The last step in the process is to set the grommets into the ½ inch strip between the boning channels on either side of the opening. I've tried all sorts of grommet tools, and I don't like any of them very much, but this time I'm using one that cuts a hole in the fabric at the same time that it squeezes the 2 halves of the grommet together. It doesn't work perfectly, but the grommets are set firmly into the fabric, which is more than I can say for some other methods I've tried.